Everyone in Clay County laughed the first morning Walter Briggs started feeding his dirt. He was 60 years old, thin through the shoulders, with a back that had begun to bend from years of lifting feed sacks, fence posts, and broken machinery nobody else wanted to touch. His hands looked less like hands than old roots pulled from hard ground, cracked at the knuckles, dark under the nails, wrapped in small cuts that never had time to heal. Just after sunrise, Walter backed his dented blue pickup to the edge of the south field and unloaded a heap of rotten hay, composted manure, crushed corn stalks, leaf mold, and black pond sludge that smelled strong enough to stop a truck on the road. The field in front of him was 50 acres of tired Kansas ground. It had grown corn for so many years that the soil had turned pale and hard, cracking in long gray lines every summer and sealing over like concrete after every rain. Most men would have hit it with fertilizer, planted deeper, borrowed more money, and prayed for a wet June. Walter did something else. He spread the rotten mix over the field like he was laying a blanket across a sick animal. Then he climbed down from the old tractor, knelt in the rows, and pressed both hands into the dirt as if he expected it to answer him. By mid-morning, the first pickup slowed on the gravel road. It was red, clean, and new enough to shine in the sun. The driver rolled past Walter's mailbox, tapped his brakes, then leaned toward the passenger window to get a better look. His mouth twisted into a grin. A second truck came behind him, then a third, each one slowing where the road curved along the south field. Walter heard the tires crunching gravel. He heard one man laugh through an open window. He heard the tailgate rattle as a truck stopped near the ditch, and two men stared across the rows like they had found a circus act instead of a farmer. Walter did not look up. He kept forking spoiled hay into the spreader. Every few minutes, he paused to press one hand against his lower back. Sweat ran from under his hat and gathered in the gray stubble on his chin. His shirt stuck to his spine before the day had even turned hot. He was not spraying the corn. He was not rushing irrigation pipe across the rows. He was not buying the expensive fertilizer everyone else had ordered before planting season. He was feeding the soil instead of the crop. By noon, the smell had drifted into town ahead of him. At Miller's Feed and Supply, the bell over the door rang when Walter walked in for twine. 3 men near the counter stopped talking. One of them had a seed cap pushed high on his forehead and a paper cup of coffee in his hand. Another stood with his thumbs hooked through his belt loops, his boots still clean from riding a tractor cab all morning. Walter placed the twine on the counter. Nobody said anything at first. Then one man lifted his cup, sniffed the air, and smiled without kindness. Another looked down at Walter's mud-caked boots and shook his head. The feed store owner rang up the twine slower than usual, his eyes flicking toward the others as if waiting to see who would speak first. Walter paid in small bills, folded the receipt, and walked out. Behind him, the laughter finally broke loose, muffled by the closing door, but sharp enough to follow him to the sidewalk. At the diner, the story grew larger by supper. Grease popped on the flat-top grill. Coffee cups clicked against saucers. Walter sat alone at the end booth, eating toast because it was cheaper than a full plate. Across the room, 2 farmers leaned close over meatloaf and mashed potatoes. One of them glanced at Walter's table, then dragged his fork through the gravy in the shape of a row. The other man laughed so hard he coughed into his napkin. Walter kept his eyes on his plate. When he lifted his coffee, his hand trembled just enough for the dark surface to ripple. From the road, from the feed store, from the diner windows with their dusty blinds, it looked like madness. 50 acres of struggling corn stood under a thin, strange carpet of farm waste, old hay, and black muck. The smell carried on the hot wind. Buzzards circled over the creek bottom. Walter kept moving up and down the rows without looking toward anyone. The men who laughed did not know he had been watching that field longer than any of them. They did not know he had spent winter nights reading his father's notebooks under a yellow kitchen light. They did not know he had found soil maps, old rainfall records, and brittle pages from his grandfather's farm journal tucked inside a cigar box in the attic. They only saw an old man wasting his last chance. The Briggs farm had once been one of the proud places in the county. Walter's grandfather had bought the first 80 acres after coming home from the war, then added pasture, creek bottom, and a white farmhouse with a tin roof that sang during storms. Walter's father had raised cattle, corn, and 2 children there, and for decades the farm had carried the family name like a flag. But by the time Walter took it over, that flag was hanging by threads. His father had spent his last 2 years sick with lung trouble, moving slower each season, trying to keep the place alive with duct tape, borrowed money, and pride. The old tractor missed more mornings than it made. The barn roof leaked into the hayloft. The north fence leaned so badly that the posts looked tired. The cattle had been sold off one small group at a time to cover bills. The year before Walter took over, the corn burned in a late summer dry spell. The year before that, spring rain packed the fields flat and drowned the low rows. The banknote grew heavier every season, until Walter could feel it sitting on his chest even when he slept. The letter from Prairie State Bank came in March. It was polite, official, and cold. Walter had one growing season to bring the farm account back into order. If the fall crop failed, the bank would move forward with foreclosure. A land company from Wichita had already been buying up struggling farms in the area, cutting old homesteads into larger operations where nobody knew who had built the barns or buried the dogs behind the machine shed. Walter read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. His father's chair sat empty across from him. A coffee ring stained the wood near the place where the old man used to sort seed receipts. Outside, wind pushed dust across the yard in little brown sheets. He could have sold then. People said he should. At 60, with no wife left in the house and no children eager to come back, he could have signed the papers, paid the bank, and rented a small place in town. He could have taken a job driving parts for the implement dealer and let someone else worry about rain. But every time Walter looked out at the fields, he saw more than debt. He saw his grandfather walking behind a team of horses in black spring mud. He saw his father lifting him onto a tractor fender when he was 6. He saw the creek where he had caught crawdads barefoot. He saw the windbreak his mother had planted one cottonwood at a time. So he stayed. And when planting season came, he made the choice that turned the whole county against him. The county agent came out in late May and walked the south field with a tablet tucked under one arm. He stopped at the edge of the mulch, pressed his boot into it, then looked across Walter's uneven rows. His face did not laugh, but his silence did. He lifted a handful of the composted mixture, let it fall through his fingers, and brushed his palm on his jeans, as if the dirt had embarrassed them both. At the fence line, a neighbor stood beside his truck with one elbow on the hood. He did not step into the field. He only watched Walter bend, straighten, bend again, and move down the rows with the stiff, careful motion of a man whose joints had begun arguing with him. Walter listened to the agent's advice. He nodded once. He did not defend himself. That was what bothered people most. He never argued. He never raised his voice at the diner. He never stood at the feed store counter, proving he had read more than they thought. He let them smirk while he sharpened cultivator blades, patched hoses, and hauled one more load of rotten hay from a collapsed barn 3 miles west. Every morning, he walked the field before the sun cleared the cottonwoods. He carried a small notebook in his shirt pocket and a soil probe made from an old piece of pipe. He tested the ground in different spots, squeezing crumbs of dirt between his fingers. He wrote down how far the moisture went, how warm the soil felt, where the earthworms appeared, where the corn leaves curled first, and where the mulch had blown thin. The work began to show on him. By June, Walter's belt had moved 1 hole tighter. The cords in his neck stood out when he lifted anything heavy. His knees popped loud enough in the quiet mornings that he sometimes stopped and looked around, as if someone else had made the sound. When he climbed down from the tractor, he held the fender for a long second before trusting his legs. At night, he soaked his hands in a chipped enamel bowl because the cracks in his fingers had split open from compost, twine, and dry heat. He wrapped his right wrist with a strip of old flour sack after it swelled from turning a wrench on the spreader. More than once, he fell asleep in the kitchen chair with his boots still on and woke before dawn with his back locked stiff. Still, he went out again. To anyone passing on the road, it looked slow and foolish. To Walter, it was the only conversation that mattered. The truth was buried in those old notebooks from the attic. His father had not always farmed the way the county remembered. In the oldest pages, before yields and loans and chemical bills took over, there were notes about soil that held rain for weeks, creek-bottom fields that stayed dark through August, and corn roots that reached deep enough to find moisture after the surface dried. His grandfather had written about returning manure to the land, leaving residue after harvest, planting winter rye to hold the soil, and never letting bare ground bake under summer sun. One line had stayed with Walter all winter: "The crop only eats what the soil can hold." Walter had read that sentence until it felt less like a note and more like a warning. For years, the Briggs farm had been feeding crops while starving the ground beneath them. Every season pulled more life out of the soil. Deep plowing broke its structure. Hard rains carried the best crumbs into the ditch. Heat burned away the moisture. Fertilizer could push a crop for a while, but it could not rebuild what had been lost underneath. By the time Walter inherited the farm, the problem was not weak corn. The problem was dead dirt. So he began treating the 50 acres like a living thing. The rotten hay shaded the ground and slowed evaporation. The composted manure brought back microbes and nutrients. The crushed stalks returned carbon. The pond sludge added minerals and organic matter from years of leaves settling in dark water. Clover and rye sent roots into tight layers, cracking them open where steel had only smeared them shut. Every inch of cover was meant to make the land hold rain instead of shedding it. It did not work fast. By the third week of June, Walter's corn was shorter than the fields on either side. His neighbor's rows stood straight and bright after fresh fertilizer. His looked uneven, with green strips of cover crop between them and patches where the mulch lay thick. Men driving past did not need to say anything. Their slow tires and long stares were enough. Money ran low. The diesel tank stood nearly empty. The farmhouse freezer held more ice than meat. Walter started skipping lunch and calling it habit. He fixed the tractor's fuel line with rubber tubing and wire. He patched the grain truck tarp with feed sacks. He sold his last good saddle to buy more seed for the cover rows. On the hottest afternoons, his shirt turned white with salt. He would stop at the end of a row, one hand on the tractor tire, eyes closed, breathing through the pain in his ribs where exhaustion had settled. Then he would open his eyes, drink warm water from a plastic jug, and climb back onto the seat. Some evenings, after the heat dropped and the cicadas started up in the cottonwoods, he stood alone at the edge of the field and wondered whether the whole county was right. One night in July, he sat at the kitchen table with the bank letter unfolded in front of him. Rain was forecast, but none came. Lightning flickered far to the east beyond another man's fields. The air smelled like dust and dry grass. His father's photograph hung on the wall, the old man standing beside a wagon of corn from a year when the land still had strength in it. Walter stared at the bills until the numbers blurred. His hands ached so badly he could not flatten them on the table. His lower back pulsed with each heartbeat. When he tried to stand, his knees refused him for a moment, and he stayed half-bent over the chair, like a man much older than 60. For the first time, he let himself imagine the auction, the tractors lined up in the yard, the tools spread on tables, strangers walking through the barn, opening drawers, stepping over the same boards his father had nailed down, the land company sign at the gate, the Briggs name coming off the mailbox. He almost folded the notebook shut for good. But before dawn, he woke to the sound of wind moving through the dry corn leaves. He put on his boots, walked out to the south field, and knelt between the rows. When he pulled back the mulch, the soil beneath it was still cool. Not wet, not rich yet, but cool, darker than it had been in spring, soft enough that his thumb pressed into it without cracking the surface around it. A single earthworm twisted under the hay. Walter sat back on his heels and breathed. Then he stood, opened the notebook, and kept going. By late July, the drought arrived like a door closing. The first week without rain made people nervous. The second made them quiet. By the third, every farmer in the county was watching the sky with the same tight jaw. The weather reports showed heat stacked across the plains, 98 degrees, 100, 103. The wind came hot from the southwest and never seemed to rest. Ponds shrank from the edges, pastures browned. Corn leaves rolled tight by noon and stayed that way until dark. Men who had laughed at Walter now stood in their own fields with hands on hips, looking down rows that had been perfect in June and brittle by August. Still, most expected Walter's 50 acres to fail first. His corn had not been the tallest. His rows had not been the cleanest. He had spent money on compost instead of more fertilizer, on cover crop seed instead of another chemical pass. His field looked ragged compared to the clean, bare, modern acres around it. Then the drought reached 30 days. The neighbor's corn, west of Walter, turned blue-gray. The leaves curled so tight they looked like rope. Across the road, a bigger farm with newer equipment started pumping from the well, day and night, until the water pressure dropped. In town, the diner filled with talk of crop insurance, emergency hay, and whether the county would qualify for drought assistance. Walter kept walking his rows before sunrise. He found stress, yes. He found curled leaves in the afternoon and dry patches near the high spots. But he also found something the others did not have. The soil under the mulch still held moisture. The cover crop, though burned at the tips, shaded the ground. The compost layer had settled into the top inches, holding water like a sponge. The corn roots had pushed down through channels left by rye and clover roots. In the mornings, while other fields looked tired before the sun even rose, Walter's corn opened its leaves for a few more hours of life. At 45 days without rain, people stopped laughing. Pickup trucks still slowed on the gravel road, but now the windows stayed rolled up. Men looked across the field without grinning. One truck stopped near the mailbox for nearly a minute, then rolled away without a word. At the diner, Walter noticed conversations going quiet when he walked in, not because they had nothing to say, but because the jokes had begun to rot in their mouths. The county agent came back and stood at the fence line longer than before. He stepped into the field, pushed a probe into the ground, and looked surprised when it sank deeper than expected. By 55 days, the banks of the irrigation ditch on Walter's place were still shaded with residue and weeds he had refused to scrape bare. The ditch held a thin ribbon of damp soil long after others had gone powder dry. Grasshoppers moved into neighboring fields, but Walter's mix of clover, rye stubble, and shaded soil held enough beneficial insects and birds that the damage stayed scattered instead of sweeping clean through. At 60 days, a hard white sun rose over Clay County. The land looked punished. Cornfields that had promised a strong year now rattled in the wind like paper. Wells coughed, pastures cracked. The land company trucks appeared more often, stopping at mailboxes and farm gates where families were running out of options. That afternoon, Walter received another call from the bank. The message was simple: harvest would decide the farm. He stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand, looking out at the south field. The corn was not perfect. Some edges had burned. Some ears were smaller than he had hoped. But the field was alive. When the first rain finally came, it came hard. The dry ground across the county shed water in sheets. Bare fields crusted and washed. Ditches ran brown with topsoil. But on Walter's 50 acres, the rain struck hay, residue, clover, and softened earth. It slowed. It soaked. It disappeared downward instead of racing away. By harvest, the whole county knew something had happened on the Briggs place. The first morning Walter brought out the combine. A low fog sat over the south field. The old machine waited by the gate with its paint faded, its header patched, and its belts whining before the engine fully warmed. Walter climbed the ladder slowly, gripping the rail with both hands. Halfway up, his right knee buckled, and for one frightening second he froze there, boot on the step, breath caught in his throat. Down by the road, 2 pickups had already stopped. Walter did not turn toward them. He pulled himself into the cab, sat behind the cracked steering wheel, and rested one hand on the controls. For a moment, he did not move. He looked out over those 50 acres, over the dry leaves and uneven stalks and narrow green memory of cover crop beneath them, and he saw the whole year laid out before him. The laughter, the smell of rotten hay, the bank letter, the empty freezer, the nights when his hands shook too hard to hold a pen. Then he lowered the header. The combine eased into the first row. Dry leaves snapped, stalks folded. Dust rose in a gold-brown cloud behind him. At first, all Walter could hear was the engine and the hollow clatter of old metal. Then came the sound he had been afraid he would never hear again. Corn hitting the hopper. Not a trickle, not a few scattered kernels rattling like pebbles. A steady rush, a clean, full sound, building under the engine noise until it seemed to fill the cab around him. Walter looked into the grain tank mirror. Yellow corn was gathering there. He drove 10 yards farther, then 20, then 50. The sound continued. His jaw tightened, his eyes blurred, but he did not wipe them. He kept one hand on the wheel and one hand curled around the throttle, holding himself still, as if too much feeling might shake the machine apart. At the edge of the field, the men by the road stopped leaning on their trucks. One of them straightened, another removed his cap. Nobody laughed. Walter cut the first pass all the way to the far end, turned slow, and came back beside the standing rows. When he reached the gate again, the hopper was heavier than anyone expected. He shut the machine down for a moment. The sudden silence fell over the field so completely that he could hear corn shifting inside the tank. He opened the cab door and climbed down. His boots hit the dirt. His legs trembled under him. He took 3 steps toward the grain, reached into the hopper, and filled his hand with kernels. They slid between his fingers, bright and real and warm from the machine. Walter stood there with corn in his palm, shoulders shaking once, then again. He did not cry loudly. He did not fall to his knees. He simply bowed his head over that handful of grain while the morning fog lifted, while the road stayed silent, while the field that everyone had called dead answered him back. By noon, more trucks had stopped. By afternoon, word had reached town. By evening, Walter had filled loads from a field that should have failed before all the rest. Not record corn, not miracle corn, but real corn, heavy enough to matter, clean enough to sell, more than anyone expected from 50 acres of land they had called dead. When the elevator ticket came back, Walter sat in the cab of the grain truck and read it twice. The yield was far above the county average for that drought year, better than fields that had received more fertilizer, better than fields that had looked greener in June, better than farms with newer machines and bigger loans. He folded the ticket carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket beside the notebook. By the end of harvest, Walter had enough to make the bank payment that had been hanging over him all year. The next morning, he drove to Prairie State Bank in the same dusty pickup that people had laughed at all spring. Mud from the field had dried on the running boards. Corn dust still clung to his sleeves. He parked between 2 polished cars and sat for a moment with the envelope resting on the seat beside him. Inside the bank, the air was cold enough to raise bumps on his arms. The lobby had clean floors, framed photographs of local businesses, and a bowl of wrapped candy on the counter. The teller looked up and gave Walter the careful smile people gave a man they expected to ask for more time. Walter asked for Mr. Hanley, the branch manager. A few minutes later, he stepped into the same office where he had been warned about foreclosure in March. Nothing had changed in the room. Same flag in the corner, same glass paperweight on the desk, same framed certificate on the wall. But Walter noticed that Mr. Hanley did not lean back this time. The manager sat forward when Walter placed the envelope on the desk. He opened it, removed the check, and looked at the amount. For a few seconds, only the clock on the wall moved. Mr. Hanley looked at the check again. Then he picked up the elevator tickets, one by one, reading the dates, the weights, and the field notes Walter had clipped behind them. The manager's expression shifted slowly, as if he were watching a locked door open from the wrong side. He cleared his throat. Walter waited. The man who had once explained foreclosure dates and collateral values now had both hands flat on the desk. He looked through the office window toward the south, though the field was miles away and impossible to see from there. When he turned back, his voice had lost its polished edge. He stamped the payment received. The sound cracked through the room like a hammer on a nail. Walter took the receipt. The paper shook slightly in his hand, but he did not hide it. At the door, Mr. Hanley stood and said that the bank would review the remaining note under better terms if Walter wanted to discuss next season. Walter paused with his hand on the knob. He looked back at the man, then gave one small nod. It was not forgiveness. It was not victory spoken out loud. But it was the first time all year that someone in that bank looked at him like a farmer instead of a failing account. The next week, the county agent returned with soil sample bags, a probe, and a different look in his eyes. He took samples from Walter's field and from neighboring fields for comparison. The results came back showing higher organic matter, better water infiltration, cooler surface temperatures under cover, and more biological activity than anyone expected from land that had been considered worn out. After that, the trucks came again. But this time, they did not slow down to laugh. One neighbor stopped by with his hat in his hands and walked the rows without saying much. Another asked where Walter had found enough compost. A younger farmer from 6 miles south wanted to know how thick the mulch had been. The feed store owner started keeping cover crop seed near the front counter. Even the men at the diner spoke about the Briggs place in lower voices, as if they had walked into church by mistake. Walter never made a speech. He never reminded anyone what they had said. He did not need to. The field had done all the talking. That winter, he paid down the worst of the debt, repaired the barn roof, and bought enough fencing wire to straighten the north pasture. He did not get rich in one season, and the farm did not become easy. But the land had turned a corner. The 50 acres that everyone called dead had begun to darken. When Walter lifted a spade of soil, it broke into crumbs instead of slabs. Worms moved through it. Rain soaked into it. Roots found a way through it. In spring, he planted again. More cover crops. More residue, less bare ground. He copied his father's old notes into a new ledger and added his own beneath them, writing down what worked, what failed, and what the land seemed to be asking for. Years later, people in Clay County would still talk about the drought that nearly broke them. They would remember the burned fields, the empty trucks, the bank signs, and the summer when even strong farmers looked scared. But they would also remember Walter Briggs, the 60-year-old man who fed 50 dead acres instead of chasing one desperate crop. They would remember how he stood alone while the county laughed, how he trusted old notebooks and quiet observation more than pride, how he worked when doubt sat heavier than heat, and how his strangest decision became the reason his corn survived 60 days without rain. At the edge of the south field, just beyond the mailbox, Walter later planted a small wooden sign. It did not carry his name. It did not boast about yield or money or proving anyone wrong. It held only one sentence, burned into cedar by hand. Feed the soil, and the soil will remember. Every harvest after that, when the wind moved through the corn and the black earth held firm beneath his boots, Walter knew he had saved more than a farm. He had saved the patience of his grandfather, the faith of his father, and a way of listening to land that nearly everyone else had forgotten. And the 50 acres that once looked dead kept giving back, year after year, like an old promise finally kept.